Welcome to the Woman Worriers podcast. You worry, I worry, we all do. If you're paying attention to the world today, there's a lot for women to feel worried and anxious about. As we explore the worries with curiosity and compassion, we learn to live more authentically and unleash the warrior within, someone who is strong, capable, and resilient, come what may. It's time to stop battling against yourself and start using your powers to meet everyday challenges with energy, purpose, and bravery. Now here's your host, Elizabeth Cush.
Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Elizabeth Cush, and I am a licensed clinical professional counselor in Annapolis, Maryland, where I am seeing clients virtually, all online, all the time. And although there are challenges with that, I am happy to say that the work that I'm doing with my clients, as well as the work I do with my own therapist, it works. Being online is okay. And yes, I miss seeing people face to face, but I'm so grateful and so happy to be able to continue to do my work. You can find out more at progressioncounseling.com or more about the podcast on womanworriers.com. You can also sign up for updates or the newsletter at progressioncounseling.com/Elizabeth's-newsletter. Today, we are going to be talking to Dr. Sonya Lott, who is a Philadelphia clinician who specializes in helping clients with grief and grieving and complicated grief. She is going to shatter some of our preconceived notions about grief and the stages of grief, because she's all about the research and what the true experience of grief and healing are. She is also going to share how the pandemic is impacting our experience of grief and grieving pretty profoundly. So Dr. Sonya Lott earned her PhD in counseling psychology and has been licensed as a psychologist since 1991. She's licensed in Pennsylvania and Florida and soon will be licensed in several other states. She maintains an online private clinical practice devoted to helping individuals transform their experiences of acute and complicated grief. She completed advanced training in complicated grief therapy and evidence-based treatment protocol at the Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia University's School of Social Work, where she is currently an associate. She is also trained in brain spotting, a brain-based trauma intervention. In addition, Sonya is the founder and CEO of ChemPsych, LLC, Continuing Education in Multicultural Psychology, which offers continuing education that supports mental health professionals in cultivating a multicultural orientation and is approved by the American Psychological Association to sponsor continuing education for psychologists. She serves on the advisory board of several nonprofits, including Whites Confronting Racism, an organization in Philadelphia that offers workshops for white people who desire to challenge racism and strengthen their work for racial justice. The Conference on Death and Afterlife Studies, an educational, social, and spiritual space for those seeking evidence of life after death, and the Therapy Aid Coalition, an organization with a large network of licensed trauma-informed mental health professionals that are immediately able to respond to crises occurring in the United States. Here's my conversation with Sonya. Hi, Sonya, and welcome to the Woman Worriers podcast.
Hi, Liz. I'm really grateful to be here.
So grateful for you being here. I know we all have a lot on our plates, but I know you have a lot on your plate right now. And with the pandemic and all the social justice stuff happening that's so important to pay attention to. And I know you're deep in a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. I
Yeah.
am.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, because the audience doesn't know you, could you tell us a little bit about you and what inspired you to do the work that you're doing?
So I'm a licensed psychologist I'm actually living in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
I'm licensed in Pennsylvania and Florida and soon some additional states. And I knew when I was 9 years old that I wanted to be a psychologist.
Hmm.
And so I sort of became who I was.
Hmm.
I feel like there were many roads that I didn't understand as a kid that were available as a psychologist, like teaching, which I also love.
Mm-hmm.
But I just always knew that this was the work I was here to do. Not grief at that time, but as a psychologist, as a clinician.
Hmm.
Um,
And
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 go
as
ahead.
a 9-year-old, how did you know that's what you wanted to do?
It was just, I don't know. I think I was trying to save myself and my family and extended family
Hmm.
members, loved ones. I don't know. But
Hmm.
I would save my allowance money. And there was a bookstore. I grew up in the Chicago area called Kroc and Bertano's. It
Hmm.
was sort of like what Barnes and Noble
Mm-hmm.
was until Amazon. Uh,
Yeah.
and I would save my allowance and I would buy books on Freud. I don't know, no matter how smart you are at 9 years old, you're still very limited in your ability to think abstractly. So I don't know what sense I made of his work at that time. But I bought Viktor Frankl, In Search of Meaning, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. And so I had a few diagnoses, like really nervous, too sad, and I would write letters to people and tell them of my love for them and my concern for their mental health. And my prescriptions were always one of the books. I really thought that the books would be the cure. So I don't know. I just always was. And
Yeah.
so I just had to get the legitimacy behind me and the permission to, quote, treat people. I had to
Yeah.
get the degrees and then wait for people to show up. So I don't know.
And so then what steered you down the path of really focusing on complicated grief and grief?
Well, I was aware that I was called to doing grief work when I was an undergraduate, and I was really afraid of it then. I mean, I was too young, and then when I was 21 and went to graduate school, I took a death, dying, and bereavement course, and I cried the whole semester.
Oh.
So I had a lot of growing up to do and dealing with my fear of death, and I needed to experience death and, manage the triggers that come with loss when other people talk about theirs. And so then in 2015, I had been teaching full time I taught for full time almost 20 years and never thought I was going back to clinical. And
Wow.
my mom died. And, to date, that has been the most profound loss that I've
Mm.
ever experienced.
Yeah.
And I was so profoundly broken open, is the only way that I can really describe it. And I knew that day that down the road, once I allowed myself to have my process, that I was going to return to clinical work and I was going to out of gratitude and grace to offer the same transformational process or something similar to other people. And then also, I have to be honest and say that my mom now bosses me around in ways that I didn't let her do in the physical. And she told me very soon after she died that this was my next step, my way of finding meaning really in my living without her. And she she promised and has shown that she's working with me
Mm.
in this process. So I'm
Mm.
being obedient.
I love that. Got to listen to your mom, right? Oh, so for so many people, and what you hear referenced all the time around grief is these 5 stages, Kubler-Ross's 5
Oh
stages
my.
of grief. So
Yeah.
can you talk to us a little bit about maybe why we shouldn't be paying so much attention to that?
Yeah. First, I just want to express my gratitude for you inviting me to comment on that. And I was listening to Gail Crothers' podcast with you from in May about equine therapy. And she mentioned this, and she said that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who offered us so much in relation to understanding the process of dying, palliative care, near-death experiences, a psychiatrist who was very much revered, that she proposed these 5 stages of grief for people who were dying, who had gotten a terminal diagnosis. And shortly before she died, she said, I wonder if this also applies to the grief process that survivors experience. She and David Kessler then wrote a book based on that hypothesis. And it was published shortly after she died in 2005. She died in 2004. And it's become, like Gail also said, like this cult phenomena. People have latched onto it. And the problem with it is that it's just not a valid theory of the grief process at all. There's been a plethora of research that refutes the validity of it, not just that people who believe this theory is truth will say, well, the stages aren't linear. You don't always go through all of them. No, the stages are not. And so, in addition to the research that has refuted the validity of this experience for people who are grieving the loss of a loved one, saying that there are 5 stages doesn't tell us anything about what's the function of grief, how do people cope with the loss, what happens if you don't go through all the stages, when is clinical intervention needed. And it creates a situation where people, I hear this all of the time with complicated grief, that, I didn't go through the 5 stages, or I think something is wrong with me. And so, it's just really harmful in many ways. And therapists who believe this won't move further they'll stay in the pop psychology and the non-mental health ideas about grief instead of learning about all of the theories and the plausible research. And so it's really harmful that it's still being promoted. And now there's, quote, a 6th stage where, a psychologist, Robert Niemeyer, spent 20 years publishing over 400 peer-reviewed journal articles about finding meaning. That's not a stage either. So it's really deceptive. It's not true. It sets people up for complicated grief, feeling like something's wrong with their experience. And again, there's so many plausible theories of grief. So I'll stop there.
So maybe talk to us about what are the plausible stages of grief, or what are the plausible aspects of grief, and what is it that, before we get to complicated grief, what is the grieving process?
Okay. Well, first, acute grief, response to the death of a close loved one, is usually inevitable. We can suppress it in some cases, but it's inevitable, and I know what that's like. You've also experienced significant loss.
Yes.
And it just breaks you down.
It hurts.
Yes. Yes. In a way that nothing else can, because of it's the love, it's a connection, it's the person being so integral part of who you are. And so the acute grief is messy. That's what we know. It is messy and it is normal. And the way through is through. So what the theories tell us, for example, there's a theory by Strobe and Shute, who also wrote a really excellent article, peer-reviewed in a peer-reviewed journal, Omega, about the problems with the 5 stages of grief theory. But it's called the dual processing theory of grief, and they talk about the importance of oscillating between focusing on the loss and focusing on restoration, like really leaning into all of the aspects of grief and then taking a respite from it.
Mm.
In my work with people with complicated grief, we do that process in a session, and it's recommended that people do that in their day-to-day living. People think, and this is another thing that's promoted, that because grief is an expression of our love, that we must stay in grief. We must continue to suffer to show our love, or to be loyal to the person who's, I believe, gotten their freedom through leaving their body.
Yeah.
So that's one theory. William Warden also talks about, most theorists talk about tasks associated with integrating one's grief. And so he talks about 4 tasks. Teresa Randall talks about 6 tasks. But leading into the grief, which, by the way, and this is another limitation of the Kubler-Ross theory, leaning into your grief is leaning into more than just the sadness and the yearning and the loss, the longing for the person. It's leaning into oftentimes what might become a spiritual crisis, questioning everything that you've ever thought about a, quote, God, and how this could happen, and it's also leaning into the physical aspects of grief, and needing to take care of oneself more,
Yeah.
So it's those are a couple of, Teresa Randall's 6 stages or 6 tasks. I'm sorry. See, I'm conditioned to say that.
I know, right?
6 tasks of grief, and Warden's 4 tasks of grief. But those are some of the theories, and we believe that it, again, is a natural process. It's just about how do we get to the, quote, other side? How do we integrate the ongoing longing and missing the individual as we move forward with our living with new purpose and meaning and joy, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, and so my brief, or, minimal understanding, I did a little research before you and I talked, and, before this conversation, about complicated grief.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to paraphrase, but what I think complicated grief is that you sort of stay in the more acute, like you're not able to integrate the grief and as you say, find joy, find a purpose in your life beyond the grief. But I would like you to give us a definition of what complicated grief is.
Okay. Well, Biz, that's pretty much spot on.
Okay.
And so I want to say that grief is always complicated.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, I think about my own experience. So my dad died 3 years ago. And our relationship was really complicated. I know he loved me, but there was a lot of shitty things that happened in our relationship. And so, it was like I'm grieving, and yet I was angry too. So there was a lot. It was messy.
And see, if we don't have permission to know that it's okay to be angry with the people we love, if we can't honor the truth of what the relationship was, then we can end up in what has been called complicated grief, which we're now shifting to referring to as prolonged grief disorder. And just saying prolonged grief disorder makes it easier to understand what it really is.
Yes.
So at present, the ICD-11 gives the criteria of at least 6 months since the loved one has died, where the person is somehow, quote, stuck in this grief process. They haven't been able to successfully integrate the grief. The DSM-5 has it as a persistent bereavement, as a diagnosis that needs further research. It's also listed as an other trauma and stressor-related disorder. But the committee that has been working on that, quote, further research, the DSM-5 team has decided that in its next edition, whatever that might be, DSM-5 oops or DSM-5 TR.
Right. Point 2. Right.
Yeah. that it's going to be referred to as prolonged grief disorder, consistent with the ICD-11, but they're proposing a year-long period. If after a year, an individual is still, their grief is interfering with their day-to-day functioning, then they would have that diagnosis. So it's sort of, the time frames are important, but they're not carved in stone. If somebody at 6 months is really suffering, and there's a evidence-based treatment that you can offer them, like complicated grief therapy, you don't need to wait a year, to begin that process. So it's characterized by people get derailed in the process. So what complicated or quote prolonged grief looks like is that the person is somehow stuck in survivor's guilt. I'm still living. This was my child. I didn't have my child for them to die. They should have buried me. Or had I known they were so sad, I would have reached out or, encouraged them to go talk to a therapist. People get stuck in the what if, imagining scenarios that if they just hadn't taken that vacation, they wouldn't have had the car accident. They may get stuck in anger and bitterness, if they don't really feel that they have permission to feel. It's not nice to say bad things about dead people,
Right. It's so true.
So, people can get stuck there if they move into what's referred to as complicated spiritual grief, that if they're questioning, like, how could a God that I believed would, because
take this person
from me.
And
or what type of God would let such a violent thing happen? They can get stuck there. They can get stuck in the fear of approaching things that remind them, the triggers of things that remind them of their loved ones. So they're excessively avoiding or excessively clinging to. You see people who may or may not be a hoarder, but the room, for example, of their loved one is just the same as they left it 5 years ago when they died.
Right.
So it's that stuckness, and these are some of the common derailers that get people stuck. If they haven't had support, or they feel like their grief doesn't look like it's supposed to. Again, not just the 5 stages of grief, but society, we have all types of prescriptions for people. You should cry a lot, but then not after this time. And after a week, you should go back to work and be okay. And
Right. You can take your week of bereavement leave, but then you should be fine.
Right. Deal with it, get over it, come on back, and we'll act like nothing happened.
Yeah.
So by the time that people get to complicated grief, if you will, or prolonged grief, people are tired of listening. We don't have people don't really have a tolerance in the first place because it triggers their own loss. They don't know what to do. They don't understand that certain aspects are lifelong. And so if they don't have the support, or people don't understand, that sort of sets them up for prolonged grief also.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious, can prolonged grief come about? Can we experience prolonged grief from, say, not necessarily a death, but like the loss of our relationship, or, divorce, or something like that?
Well, that's really, thank you for that question. It's a wonderful question. And in theory, yes. However, the quote diagnosis of complicated or prolonged grief is only as it relates to the death of a loved one, a death. But we acknowledge, meaning we, people who are in the, field of grief, that anytime we lose something of value or let go of it ourselves, there is a loss, there's a sense of loss, and there's a grief process that we need to honor. And so many people get stuck in the grief around the loss of a relationship, divorce, as you mentioned. And so typically that ends up being called depression.
Okay.
And a lot of times that's another thing about the 5 stages, the idea of depression. Depression is something different than grief, and we really need to be able to distinguish between the two. So what ends up happening is that people who are in extended or long-term grief after a divorce, for example, and if you think about it, there are many losses, secondary losses, like maybe the loss of financial security, loss of meaning in living. When you get a divorce, I'm no longer a husband or a wife, and all of that. That's very similar to what we experience as secondary losses after the death of a loved one. But we typically look at that and call it depression rather than, prolonged grief.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Clinically, to be able to sort of, have it in its own little compartments.
Yeah, but it actually feels really the same for a lot of people. And one of the things about divorce is that, or breakup, you can always hold on to the hope, false or real, who knows, that we might be able to reconcile. But when somebody dies, what we know is that they're not coming back in the same physical way in this lifetime, ever.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so how do you help your clients move from complicated grief to integrated grief?
Okay. The most important thing is really the same as when we're working with anybody else. It's being fully present with the person. And that's particularly important with like trauma, any type of trauma, and grief is often traumatic, even if the person didn't die traumatically, the abrupt absence of, or even if the person is dying, the abrupt reality of them no longer being here is traumatic. And by the time somebody shows up, it could be 6 months, a year, 10 years, with complicated or prolonged grief. People have stopped listening long, long ago. People have stopped being able to, if at all, witness the profound depth of their grief. So that's first and foremost, that you are present and that you can hold their grief, without making it about you. And so clients come to me and tell me, they've seen therapists before who had to get up and excuse themselves to go to the bathroom repeatedly. And it's like, what's happening here? That it was triggering the therapist, or feeling like, if I really go to the depths of my emotional pain, this person won't be able to tolerate it. And they worry about needing to take care of, the therapist. Not to mention family members who aren't trained, or mental health professionals at all. So that's the first part. And then there is an evidence-based protocol, 16 to 20-ish session, semi-structured protocol that was developed by a psychiatrist, Kathy Shear, who is at Columbia University now. She founded the Center for Complicated Grief, which is where I did my training in complicated grief, and where I'm still an associate and in relationship with she and the other therapists and trainers. And so it's there are components of CBT-like components. There are some parts that come from motivational interviewing, some parts that are like exposure therapy from behavioral therapy. So it's sort of a mix of aspects that help us to let the person get unstuck and get through the task of grief, So it's like helping them to deal with the avoidance of activities. We set it up in a very behavioral way, situational revisiting, it's called, where we, like if they're having difficulty looking at photographs, or for example, watching television shows that they used to watch with their loved one. We might start with choosing one of those shows, looking at the level of anxiety that comes up and thinking about that, as well as the level of desire to do it. Maybe watching 5 minutes. And next week doing more. But just helping people with everything that's got them blocked, with the ways of thinking, the counterfactual, we talk about it, ways of thinking that had I done this and, maybe they wouldn't have died, or, they hadn't taken that vacation. Helping them to integrate the complexities of the loved one. Like you said with your father, I too had a really complicated relationship with my dad. it was like crazy love, but there was some complicated stuff in there.
Yeah.
Being able
Yeah.
to help the person to fully integrate that and be okay with that, helping them to recognize their ongoing connection with the person. There's a series of memory worksheets that they get in a particular sequence. There's helping them to tell the story of the death, sort of taking the therapist back with them to bring the grief forward again from the moment they learned of the death and helping them to reprocess it.
Yeah. So it
yeah.
sounds like it's a very sort of not necessarily step by step, because I'm sure everybody's experiences are different, but
Right.
there is kind of a prescribed way to move through this to help them then go to the integration.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And like I said, it's several studies have been done that suggest that it's the efficacy of this particular protocol, with modifications as needed, as you just mentioned, is more effective than CBT, than interpersonal therapy and others, And I have to say that I sit in such gratitude for it having found me, really, because it's really transformational work that happens. It's really transformational work.
I bet. I mean, to go from a place of just being, so caught up in the grieving process that you can't move forward, that it must be, just so transformational to be able to then say, okay, I can not stop grieving, because we are, the people we love will always be in our hearts, but you can let it go to the extent that you can and move forward.
Absolutely. With joy and purpose. See with new eyes, and I often think about the metaphor of a butterfly, sort of those really ugly and unrecognizable stages, or really painful, rather than ugly, but painful parts. And you, in the end, can become this beautiful, emotionally free, or at least in part emotionally free, who can, leave the therapy and, not recognizing who you were before,
Nice. Sounds amazing. So I want to touch briefly before we wrap this up, because I know there's been with the time we're living in, with the pandemic, with all the losses we're feeling around just our way of life that's been kind of taken away from us. What are you seeing as far as the pandemic and loss, and how is that all affecting us?
Ooh.
I know that's a big question.
It's
a big question.
So I'm going to do it in two parts. Let me talk about first the losses. Ken Doka talks about, who's a death, dying, and bereavement expert, talks about he offered us the idea of disenfranchised grief, grief that isn't really recognized or isn't socially acceptable to recognize, and it's everything that we are experiencing as a result of the pandemic, and especially because of the way that it's being managed or not managed. So that, there's a big loss, secondary loss, is the loss of the illusion of control.
Yes.
That's how we hold ourselves together, is with this illusion that we have some control over our lives.
Silly us. Yeah, right.
Yeah, right, exactly. And this pandemic, where you can be as careful as humanly possible and still contract it, and you don't know what the course of the illness will be, if you're going to survive, and all of that just strips that away. There's the loss of physical touch. Hugging.
So, yes, that has been very hard for me.
Yes, and I mean, hormonally, oxytocin is released when we hug our loved ones, And I'll just say this, speaking of, I'm thinking back to equine therapy. If you have a dog or cat, and I know you have a dog.
I do. Yes.
they're all, I think our animals are emotional support, therapists for us, even if they don't have a little jacket or a little collar, you
Yes.
know.
Yes. They pick up on so much. And even if they're not picking up on it, it's like, to me, one of my favorite things is if my dog comes to sit next to me, to just like pause, just touch him, feel his fur, notice his movements, like when he wants to lick my face. Like, it just is very grounding. And as like with equine therapy, like they're so present with us, which
Right,
is
right.
really nice.
And accepting, loving, always happy to see us, unconditional love all the time.
Yes.
And so in this pandemic, I want to recommend that you give them extra treats for their work, but hug, 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 love on them and let them love on you. It's oxytocin's released in our dogs and cats too. So it's
Yeah.
mutually beneficial. So we're missing that. There's a lack of security, even for people who are able to work from home. For us, as mental health professionals, we don't know. There's the ebb and flow normally, but particularly during the pandemic, there's for people, a lot of people, the loss of physical safety. They're losing their place of residence,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Or their businesses, or
right.
Yeah.
Food insecurity.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of secondary losses. Now
And two, I just want to touch on just the impact that it's having on the minority communities too. That there's great, like, for a lot of reasons, but they live much closer, oftentimes live much closer together. There isn't a way to protect them as easily, but also they're not getting the medical care or trusting the medical care that they might get if they reached out.
It's true. And also they're usually essential workers paid less.
Yes. Having to work, right. And
right.
with people face to face. And
right. And then if we move away from the intersection of socioeconomic status and race or ethnicity, the marginalization, even people of color who are, quote, well-to-do, have a greater incidence of all types of chronic illnesses.
Right.
That, and that's a 400-year history that's beyond our podcast. But the physical impact of racial trauma every day of our living puts us at greater risk for, if we do contract the COVID-19, to have complications, and to the likelihood of dying is greater.
Right.
So it's really complex. But what I do want to say is that COVID-19 is no different than any other illness because of our history of marginalization in this country, and I'm speaking in regard to all people of color, including immigrants. Then we are at greater risk for all types of chronic illnesses anyway, and death and, all of that. But I also wanted to speak about how the death of loved ones during the pandemic is also increasing the likelihood of complicated grief or prolonged grief for people. And one is that more people, you're likely to lose more people in a shorter period of time. In families where everybody's infected and 2-3 family members die in a week's time or a month's time or 3 months' time, that's, you're compounding the grief processes. You can't get through one before there's another, and it's dramatic. And we're more likely to experience complicated grief if we feel like the death didn't have to happen. And with the pandemic, we know, and the different estimates have varied, but 100,000, tens of thousands, had the president acted on what we now know he knew in February, the virus wouldn't have spread in the way that it has, and there would have been fewer deaths. So it's hard to find meaning, as Robert Niemeyer's been talking about for over 20 years, in or getting to peace around somebody dying, when honestly they really didn't, quote, have to, unless, of course, on a more spiritual level, you can reconcile that this is the way that it was supposed to be. But it's harder to get to that when people are dying when they really don't have to, particularly under these circumstances. And the other thing I want to say, and trying to still be mindful of time, is that we don't get to, having our grief witness is so important, and having people around us to bring us.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
To support us and to be with us in this.
I mean, we can't do that, or we do it at risk, and thank goodness for, technology. So, you can do virtual funerals and things like that, but it's not the same. Some people can't even retrieve their loved ones' bodies because they're in a refrigerated truck.
Right.
And more, morgues are overflowing and funeral homes. And
if you couldn't even be with them in a hospital while they were dying, like to be important through that process. Yeah.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Thank you for mentioning that. That is so crucial. And while we often are not with our loved ones when they die, what happens in grief is that's one of the what ifs. If they would have, or I would have been able to have been with them, then maybe they wouldn't have, quote, suffered. It's the wondering if, did they suffer because they were alone? And,
Right. Did they know I was thinking about them?
Right.
And then
Right.
Oh.
So I want to really, there are only around 30 of us, around 40 in the world, about 30 of us here who are trained in complicated grief and also have gained expertise. A lot of people have done the level 1 and 2 training, but to become a practitioner, you do the training and then you need to get the experience.
Sure.
So there are more of us who have done the training. There might be maybe 150, and have done the actual training to learn the protocol. You can learn it without, showing up for the training. You can buy the manual and all that. But all of that to say, we need so many more of us to do this training, because we are beginning to, and will continue to see an onslaught of people who are really struggling with grief as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we need more practitioners.
Yes, indeed. I agree. Well, if listeners wanted to know more about complicated grief and how to find you, if they wanted to work with you, how do they do that?
Okay. So I want to first offer, in terms of resources for therapists, as well as the public, for the Center for Complicated Grief. And it's complicatedgrief.columbia.edu.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. And so even though it's about, quote, complicated grief, it's also about acute grief. And there are a wealth of resources, videos and things around coping with grief in the pandemic, and just a wealth of information. There's continuing education training, including the learning the protocol, but just webinars about suicide and grief, and from scholars from around the world.
Oh, nice.
And there's also a therapist directory there to find me and other people who are trained. And if you're dealing with acute grief, if you seek out any therapist who's trained in complicated grief, they will know about, of course, acute grief. You'll be in good arms and hands, if you will, if you reach out to them. And if you're interested in learning more about me or working with me, my website is drsonyalott.com, DRSONYALOTT.com.
Awesome.
And my contact information is there, email and phone numbers on the website.
Nice. Well, I will definitely include that, your Facebook page, the Center for Complicated Grief, all in the show notes. Awesome. So people can easily access them there. Yes. Well, Sonya, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, but spending time with us on the podcast today. I really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Biz. Again, I'm really grateful. I was grateful for the invitation and to be in communion with you in this way via podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Sonya. That was quite a conversation and filled with a lot of information about acute grieving, integrated grief, as well as complicated grief. I encourage you, if you want to know more, to check out Sonya's website as well as the Center for Complicated Grief. It's very easy to access information as far as easy to understand. It's not super clinical. And if you feel like you're stuck in your grief or grieving, then check that out, because I think we do tend to, as a culture, we are clinging to this outdated, unresearched or unvalidated research around the stages of grief and grieving, and they're not relevant. They're not proven. They don't hold up to science. And I think sometimes when we feel like we should be moving forward or we haven't gone through this particular stage, we can pile on the shame and the guilt about why we can't move on or why we're not grieving in the right way, when really that's just not true. You're just grieving. You are where you are. And if you do feel like you're stuck, maybe you are in a cycle of complicated grief, and there's help. There's ways to move through and forward so that, as Sonya said, you can live a life filled with joy and purpose, which is what you deserve. Well, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. As I said, you can find out all of the links in the show notes for this episode, and you can also find links to sign up for the newsletter. So if you want to have the podcast episodes delivered to your inbox and you want to make sure you're not missing anything, I also offer just some mindfulness tips as well as a little bit of where I am in the world at that moment. So you can find that at progressioncounseling.com/Elizabeth's-newsletter. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I hope you all take care of yourselves if you're grieving or have lost a loved one. I hope you can find some peace and joy. Ciao for now from this Woman Worrier.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Woman Worriers podcast. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. Music was written and performed by Andy Cush. If you'd like more information on this episode, you can find the show notes, the resources shared today, and links to the guest profiles at womanwarriors.com.